Hello and welcome. My name is Victoria and I'm an international trade and customs consultant. On this channel, I discuss topics related to international trade and movement of goods across borders. And today I want to talk about coffee. Coffee is a commodity that has been considered at a certain time the second most traded commodity after oil. That is, of course, a myth because of how famous the coffee has become. And it is quite rare that we would encounter somebody that does not on occasion indulge in a cup of coffee, even if this is not a daily habit, which is quite a common occurrence in many people's lives. But I've been noticing that coffee has been getting incrementally more expensive. And I started wondering whether this is primarily related to the usual inflation that we've been observing, or I thought to myself, maybe the fair trade that was marketed to us in the 2000s has been making trade in coffee progressively fairer. Well, it turns out that not necessarily. And we could actually, in fact, be running out of coffee. And this has happened before, not so long ago. Coffee drinking today is associated to many different countries. In fact, it's one of those cultural legacies almost that seems to have engulfed many different countries around the world, regardless of their overwhelming history. An interesting fact that I found was that the United Kingdom originally was not actually obsessed with the tea, but its first passion was actually coffee. Coffee, around the 17th and 18th centuries, was associated to coffee houses that became very popular in the major cities, also called penny universities. And they were serving as social hubs for people for a price of 1 penny to buy one coffee cup in order to indulge and engage in intellectually stimulating conversations. These coffee houses were hubs for access to newspapers. There were places where people that had no access to higher education could go and listen to experts talk about different subjects related to politics, science, that for the most part would generally be accessible to the elites exclusively. And so coffee houses at the time were quite central gathering spots where people could interact, discuss, and even give origin to specific institutions. Similar coffee houses also existed in Europe, and some would even say that such coffee houses were actually a contributing factor to the French Revolution in the 18th century. But coffee lost its footing at a given point in history for one specific reason, which we are also observing today, which was a fungus infestation, a fungus called coffee leaf rust, which appeared in full force around the 1860s, and it almost entirely wiped out the monoculture of coffee beans in what today is known as Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka at the time was the biggest supplier of coffee, and it was dominated by both the Dutch and the British. But this coffee leaf rust is what led the farmers to essentially burn down their bean fields and plant tea instead. Because the British East India Company already had a particular infrastructure, and it paved the way with other Asian suppliers like China and India to essentially ensure its monopoly over the supply of tea. And basically, they switched the national drink to the one that was easier to control, easier to tax, and also easier to protect from the disease. The coffee leaf rust at the time also appeared in different regions like Kenya, India, and other parts of Asia, called Java and Sumatra, which were under the Dutch control. And in order to mitigate the situation, in order to avoid destroying the coffee bean fields, the Dutch implemented different strategies, such as indeed adoption of tea plantations, but also introduction of plantation of the coffee beans that were of slightly lesser quality, but they were more resistant to pests. In the same manner, the majority of the coffee bean production was actually transported to the Central and South America, because this is where the climate seemed to have been more appropriate for the coffee beans. Of course, production of any given commodity is never consistent, and there are always changes in supply chains, also considering all of the historical movements that have been occurring, different empires disintegrating, other political structures forming. Same goes for a variety of businesses, as well as the environmental conditions. In any case, I don't want to go through full of history, but I do want to make the connection with 1999. In 1999, the price of coffee drastically decreased due to sudden oversupply, which was primarily generated by Vietnam, where state sponsorship generated overproduction. It seems to me, however, that their original plan didn't necessarily render the results that they expected, because instead of actually becoming the leader in supply of coffee, they ended up flooding the markets. And Brazil at the time also had issues related to devaluation of its currency, leading the farmers to essentially dumping their coffee on the international markets, leading to oversupply and a drastic drop of the price of coffee, which led many farmers to abandon their farms and lose business. Mind you that there are different sorts of coffee being produced. The most famous one are Robusta beans and the Arabica beans. The Robusta beans are considered to be lower quality, but they are also more resistant to different environments and diseases. It's just the Robusta beans are not as aromatic as the Arabica beans, for instance. The Arabica beans are considered to be more sophisticated and less strong, but they're also more sensitive to the different environmental changes as well as the diseases. In 1999, it was also noted that market regularization was not very well developed, and so different countries around the world trading in similar commodities did not have an institution that could essentially determine a price for their coffee, but also implement different quotas on import and export, just to make sure that different producers weren't just dumping their coffee around the world onto different markets, which eventually led to a crisis in that particular period of time. This supports the claim that international supply chains are quite volatile and are an ever-shifting phenomenon. After 1999, solutions were found. Many farmers were essentially advised to focus on quality of their coffee beans rather than quantity. Because Vietnam was able to produce a bigger quantity of the Robusta beans, which were lower in quality, many smaller farmers around the world were essentially advised to focus their efforts on the Arabica, the better quality coffee beans, in order to make sure that they could provide an alternative sourcing solution where true coffee connoisseurs would focus on acquiring better quality rather than focusing on the quantity. And of course, coffee is not something that is exclusively used as a drink. There are other uses for coffee, and sometimes the worst quality of that coffee can be the perfect commodity for those buyers. The problem, however, is that quite recently, around 2012, there has been quite a strong re-emergence of the coffee leaf rust, and it's affecting plantations in devastating proportion. And this is bound to reshape international trade of coffee once again. And the ironic notion is essentially that the smaller farmers will be the ones mostly affected, because they've been focusing on the Arabica beans, and the Arabica beans are the ones that are affected by this disease the most, because Robusta beans and a few other varieties of coffee beans are somewhat more resistant to the coffee leaf rust. And this is why the markets can also be acting strange, because some news regarding a plantation or a potential environmental shift or some weather concerns for a particular period can influence the price of coffee for the next year or so. And so even a minor rust outbreak in Brazil or Vietnam, for example, can cause increases in future projections of prices. So to fight the rust fungus, many producers tend to utilize pesticides and fungicides. These, however, tend to leave chemical residues, which are controlled on import into the EU and the US, for example. Some coffee batches can be rejected because there's too much chemical residue, and so even though that coffee is being saved, it is not necessarily in accordance with the standards imposed by the importing countries. So this situation again becomes somewhat ironic, but obviously there is only sadness in this situation, to the extent where the only solution to maintaining the crops alive is to essentially use the chemicals that will eventually not allow those crops to be sold. Additionally, and apart from supply chain disruptions, several players on the market, several businesses, end up monopolizing the supply of coffee, because fighting the fungus requires quite a lot of research and development. It also requires new ways of dealing with the chemicals that are kept as residue, for example. It requires new technology where it comes to irrigation or specialized fungicides. It also requires maybe lab-developed seeds, which means that smaller family farms are essentially being pushed out of the export business, giving way to monopolies and the so-called mega exporters of coffee beans that are occupied with the industrial scale plantations in Brazil, for example, that can afford all of the technology that has to be used for the maintenance of the coffee bean. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty where it comes to the coffee market, but of course specific trends are already being observed. And in basic terms, we see environmental changes that lead to the need for technological advancements and therefore lead to corporate structures being required in order to guarantee higher levels of production. In the same manner, there is this separation in terms of quality, because the better quality is what is becoming quite luxury because it's more difficult to sustain, whereas the cheaper, less volatile crop is actually becoming the new global standard, because there are different solutions that are being additionally proposed where it comes to the quality of the beans. There are different new blends being proposed. And so the new global standard ends up being based on what is fundamentally available to us. We have seen a shift in terms of conscious purchasing in the 2000s, when there has been quite a bit of concern for smaller producers, and I do believe that this will continue to happen. And it is also very likely that technology will be shared over time. But of course, until new supply chains are consolidated, until new technology can be implemented at a larger scale, there will likely be producers that will essentially go out of business. And of course, we see the movement towards monopolization of the production, which in my opinion is not necessarily the best of news. So to finalize, if you're interested in exploring other commodities, please leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe or leave a like. Or if you have a need for a more professional consultation, please do not hesitate in contacting me on my website. I will leave the details below the video. Also, where it comes to customs compliance, for instance, if you're dealing with a commodity like coffee or any other plant-based product, you may require some assistance with respect to the plant protection regulation. Recently, there's been quite a lot of focus on the deforestation regulation, so please do not hesitate in contacting me if you have any questions in this regard. In the meantime, thank you for watching and see you next time.